All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going deep on A.C. Ward's analysis of the first half of the 20th century in Britain, and it's a wild ride. It was a time of just incredible, earth-shattering change, but Ward frames it all as this huge, fascinating paradox, an age of unbelievable progress that was happening at the exact same time as an unbelievable regress.
So this is the central conflict, right? On one side of the coin, you've got these amazing leaps forward. I mean, we learned to fly. Cars gave millions a new kind of freedom. We created the welfare state, this incredible idea designed to protect everyone. But then you flip that coin over, and it's dark. That same scientific genius gave us mass slaughter on a scale nobody had ever imagined. Ward talks about a deep moral and spiritual relapse, and the rise of this idea of the mass man taking over the individual. So how? How did one single century produce such complete opposites?
To really unpack this massive transformation, here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to start in the Victorian world, which seemed to be built on rock-solid certainty. Then we'll meet the thinkers who came along and started asking questions about everything. We'll look at what rushed in to fill the spiritual vacuum they left behind, see how literature itself basically split in two, and then explore the social consequences of it all with the rise of the mass man. And finally, we'll wrap up by asking the really big question. What was the real cost of all this progress?
Okay, so first up, Section 1. To really get a handle on the revolution that was coming, we first have to understand the world it was kicking against. What did this Victorian world of certainty actually look like? Well, according to Ward's analysis, the Victorian mindset was built on these incredibly solid pillars. There was this widespread, almost eager acceptance of authority in politics, in religion, in the family. He says there was this innate desire to affirm, the default setting was yes, not why. And all of this was backed up by this deep, unshakable faith that their institutions were permanent. The home, the Constitution, the empire, Christianity, these weren't just seen as good ideas. To them, they were the final, perfected form of human society.
And this quote from Ward, wow, it just nails it, doesn't it? It wasn't just confidence, it was this feeling of absolute finality. They genuinely believed they were living inside a fortress of certainty, a fortress that was built to last forever.
But you know how these things go? That fortress wasn't quite as unshakable as they thought. In fact, it was about to get hit by a massive earthquake. And that brings us to Section 2, a call to question, where we meet the people holding the hammers.
A key voice leading the charge was the playwright George Bernard Shaw, and he used his characters to throw down this powerful challenge. This line from his play Major Barbara just sums it up perfectly. He's basically saying, hey, we're so quick to throw out our old machines, but we cling to our old rusty ideas. Shaw's message for the new century was simple: question, examine, test. Suddenly, everything was on the table.
Now, you can imagine, this whole question everything philosophy landed differently for different people. For some, it was like throwing open the windows in a stuffy room. It was exhilarating. But for a lot of others, it was just plain terrifying. This quote from the character Barbara really captures that feeling of vertigo, right? It's like the solid ground you've stood on your whole life just turns to sand under your feet. The old certainties were just gone.
So with the old Victorian rules gone, you've got this huge void, what Ward calls a spiritual vacuum. And, nature abhors a vacuum. Something had to rush in and fill that space, which leads us perfectly into Section 3, art, politics, and a vacuum. And basically, two big, often rival camps popped up among Britain's thinkers. In one corner, you had the art for life's sake crowd, socialists like Shaw and H.G. Wells. For them, art wasn't just for decoration. It was a tool. It had a job to do, to make society better. And in the other corner, you had the art for art's sake philosophy of the Bloomsbury Group, people like Virginia Woolf. Their whole vibe was that art, ideas, and conversation were beautiful and important on their own, not because they served some political purpose.
Now, this split, this argument about what art is even for, didn't just stay a debate among intellectuals. Nope, it spilled out and completely changed literature itself, leading to what Ward calls the Great Divide. And this timeline just makes the shift crystal clear. Before 1922, you had these literary giants, Hardy, Kipling, Wells, and they were writing for the common reader. Someone who was intelligent, but not necessarily a literary scholar. But then, 1922 happens. Boom, that is the turning point. James Joyce publishes Ulysses, and T.S. Eliot publishes The Wasteland. And according to Ward, literature started speaking a new, incredibly complex language. It was a language that, frankly, only a small elite group could understand. And look, this wasn't just a change in style. Ward describes it as a power shift, the rise of a new kind of authority, a dictatorial intellectualism. It was an attitude that kind of looked down on what it called normal intelligence, a contempt for the so-called half-educated masses who just couldn't keep up. So naturally, this super complex literature gave rise to a new kind of super academic criticism. But, and this is a great little story, it also brings up a fascinating question. When does all that deep analysis maybe cross a line and go a little too far? Get this, a famous critic, Professor Empson, built this whole elaborate, brilliant theory about a T.S. Eliot poem. His entire argument, the whole thing, rested on the placement of one single comma. The punchline? That comma was a typo. Just a simple mistake by the printer that got fixed in later editions. For Ward, this story was the perfect example of academic criticism becoming its own little game, sometimes completely disconnected from what the author ever intended. So, we've been talking about books and big ideas, but this stuff didn't just happen in a bubble. It had very real consequences for the daily lives of people in Britain. And that brings us to Section 5, the century of mass man. Let's take the welfare state. Truly, one of the century's biggest social achievements. The idea, the promise behind it, was beautiful, right? If you remove the constant grinding stress of economic hardship, people will be happier, more content. That was the dream. But according to Ward's analysis, the result wasn't universal happiness. Instead, he describes a society gripped by a widespread mood of sullen discontent, along with a rise in crime and a new frantic consumerism. So, what did this new society actually look like? Well, Ward points to a few key things. The individuals seemed to be getting swallowed up by the mass man. Advertising was getting really, really good at playing with our emotions. You saw what he calls a revolt of youth and a new cult of immaturity. A general contempt for all authority became the norm. And even the sharp art of satire was often replaced by just, angry shouting, what Ward calls witless invective. And you know who was paying very close attention to all of this? Advertisers. They had a massive aha moment. They figured out they didn't have to sell you on how good their product was. Instead, they could tap into depth psychology and sell you a feeling. They could subtly link their product to your deepest human desires: love, status, a sense of security. You weren't buying chocolates anymore. You were buying affection. You weren't buying a car. You were buying freedom. So after walking through this incredible 50-year transformation, we're left with one final, crucial question, and that brings us to our last section, progress at what cost? And it's interesting. The source suggests that with a bit of distance, we might look back on those Victorians a little differently. Maybe the things the 20th century mocked them for, their so-called hypocrisies, could actually be seen in a new light. Maybe it was a commendable reticence and modesty, especially when you compare it to the exhibitionism of the new media age that followed. And that leaves us with this final, provocative question. And man, it feels just as relevant today as it did when Ward was writing it. To move forward, to progress, we have to question the past. We have to be willing to tear down old structures. But in doing so, what essential, maybe even necessary, values do we risk losing along the way?